Welcome back to Intro to Religion, PHL 1030. We're going over Tim Bayne's book, Philosophy of Religion, a very short introduction. In this video, we'll be talking about intelligent design, the idea that the universe must have been designed by an intelligent being because it demonstrates regularly recurring patterns of orderly behavior. That if you found a watch on a desert island, you would assume, oh, some person put this watch here because it doesn't just randomly coagulate off of the ingredients on a desert island. Similarly, the universe itself seems to be a finely tuned machine, and that fine-tuning requires an explanation. So the questions that we'll be going over for exam 1 are Part A, question 3 and 4, and Part B, questions 9, 10, and 11. So before I start reading through the questions, let me just read from Bayne's book here. So design arguments. This is page 33. He says, although cosmological arguments continue to attract philosophical attention, it is design arguments, or rather one particular version of the design argument, that occupies center stage in the contemporary philosophy of religion. Design arguments, also known as teleological arguments, from the Greek word telos, which means design or purpose, have featured in philosophical discussion since the time of the ancient Greeks. All right, so before he gets to the current fine-tuning argument, which is based on the cosmological constant, or the expansion rate of space-time revealed by general relativity. So he does talk about that. First, he's giving a little history of design arguments in general, and he quotes from Cicero, from On the Nature of the Gods. So Cicero says, when we see something moved by machinery like an orrery or a clock, or many other such things, so an orrery is a mechanical reproduction of the solar system, or the Earth-centric vision of the cosmos back then. The planets move using gears and chains. So when you see something like that, we do not doubt that these contrivances are the work of reason. When, therefore, we behold the whole compass of the heaven moving with revolutions of marvelous velocity and executing with perfect regularity the annual changes of the seasons with absolute safety and security for all things, how can we doubt that all this is effected not merely by reason, but by a reason that is transcendent and divine? The planets move in regular order, and the seasons follow each other with mathematically predictable precision. So if you found such a mechanical cosmos reduced to a miniature scale and saw that somewhere, you'd say, some intelligent, rational being created it. So why don't you apply the same reasoning to the cosmos as a whole? That's the argument. And then Cicero went on to describe the same argument of intelligent design by looking at biological life. So on page 34, he says, how skillful and exact is the disposition of the various parts of the bodies of animals, how marvelous the structure of the limbs, for all the organs are so formed and so placed that none of them is superfluous or not necessary for the preservation of life. So not only the heavenly bodies moving in regular order that determine the seasons of the year, but also each living species on the earth demonstrates incredible complexity that could only be attributed to some kind of a divine architect. That's the supposition. But Tim Bayne goes on to say, although biological versions of the design argument remained popular well into the 19th century, their prospects were dealt a fatal blow in 1859 with the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. What Darwin suggested and the subsequent development of evolutionary science has confirmed is that it is possible to explain both the complexity of organisms and the fact that they are so often well suited to their environments without appealing to intelligent design. So Bayne is saying Darwinism destroyed the intelligent design arguments when it is applied to biology, because the complexity of life can be explained by the idea of random mutation and natural selection. Species emerge, some of them mutate randomly. Most often mutations are deadly to that animal, but sometimes they add a benefit. And when they do, that benefit gets handed down to the next generation over millions and millions of years. This gradual process of random mutation and natural selection for those mutations that serve the species well produced all of the variety of life. You don't need any intelligent designer. It can all happen through these random material processes. That was Darwinism. And in Tim Bayne's perspective, that dealt a fatal blow to the intelligent design theories applied to biology. It's been confirmed. This is a fact. So says Tim Bayne. However, Tim Bayne also appeals to the Big Bang Theory and general relativity, which we're about to get into. But the point of that is that according to relativity theory, the past, the present, and the future coexist. So Einstein said it's more natural to think of the universe as a four-dimensional space-time than as a three-dimensional universe evolving with time. So Darwinism dealt a fatal blow to the intelligent design theories applied to biology, but it seems to me relativity theory dealt a fatal blow to the standard interpretation of Darwinism. Because how can you have a random evolution from the beginning of the timeline to the end of the timeline if all of those points on that timeline coexist, which is what relativity theory says. And that's what the Big Bang Theory is based on. So if you believe in the Big Bang Theory, then it's difficult to believe in the standard version of Darwinism, and Einstein pointed that out. Again, there's no evolution if each point on the evolutionary timeline coexist. So although it might appear to be a random process, and it still might not be the byproduct of an intelligent designer, nevertheless, the idea of evolution of three-dimensional space is greatly complicated by relativity theory. So that is one of the questions here. So now let me go to exam 1, question part B, and the question is number 9. If the past, present, and future coexist in a four-dimensional space-time, as Einstein's special theory of relativity revealed in 1905, would that have any bearing on Bayne's claim that Darwinism dealt a fatal blow to the biological design argument in 1859? Why or why not? So I've gone over that. You can develop whatever opinions you want. Just root it in knowledge of the textbook. That's what I'm always grading on. Okay, so now continuing here on page 34, after saying that Darwinism dealt a fatal blow to that design argument in biology, he says, but the demise of biological versions of the design argument did not mark the demise of the design argument as such. And in recent decades, the argument has undergone a remarkable renaissance regarding the more fundamental forms of structure that characterize the cosmos as a whole. And he'll go on to say that, science itself cannot explain why there are laws of nature. Why is the universe a law-abiding being? Why are these regularly recurring mathematically describable patterns even there? What causes there to be a law of gravity? Science can't explain why it exists. It can just explain what the laws are. So, continuing here on page 35, Tim Bayne says, although this version of the design argument is worthy of serious attention, we will set it to one side in order to examine a version that is not based on the laws of nature. All right, so to define, all right, let me start this one again. Although this version of the design argument is worthy of serious attention, we will set it to one side in order to examine a version of the design argument that focuses not on the existence of laws of nature as such, but on the fact that the laws of nature, together with various fundamental constants, appear to be fine-tuned for life. Had these laws and fundamental constants been ever so slightly different, then intelligent life would not have occurred. Consider, for example, the cosmological constant symbolized by the Greek letter lambda, which plays a crucial role in the theory of general relativity. So, lambda is an upside-down V, and in general relativity, Einstein's theory of gravity, it describes the expansion rate of space-time. I discussed this in the previous video about the temporal and atemporal cosmological arguments for the existence of God. So the Big Bang Theory says the entire universe is expanding from a point of infinite density, a singularity, which has a lot of the elements of the definition of God as the omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient being. So, continuing here on page 35, he says, if lambda had a value that was even slightly different from its actual value, then either space would have expanded at such a rate that objects would not exhibit the stability they do, or the universe would have collapsed in on itself immediately after the Big Bang. In other words, lambda needed to have almost exactly the value that it actually has in order for the world to exhibit the kind of stability that appears to be required for intelligent life. Indeed, it has been suggested that the chances of lambda having this value are 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. Many of the other fundamental physical constants, for example, the mass of the proton, the mass of the neutron, the speed of light, the Newtonian gravitational constant, also fall within the very narrow boundaries that appear to be required for the emergence of intelligent life. Many theorists argue that these facts, which we might call fine-tuning facts, are evidence for the existence of a divine architect. So this is the fine-tuning version of the cosmological argument. And so let's just focus on the cosmological constant, the expansion rate of space-time. Again, this is an intro to religion class, so I don't expect anyone to have mastered the finer points of relativity theory, quantum mechanics, or string theory, but string theory is not mentioned by Tim Bayne, but quantum mechanics and relativity theory are, and it is important when you're discussing natural theology, the attempt to understand God just using human reason and studying the structure of the cosmos and the structure of the physical natural species and trying to discern the structure of God's mind by doing that. That's natural theology. So the point is to learn about God by studying nature, then you should take into account the best science of nature that we have available, and that's currently, in my opinion, string theory, which unites relativity theory and quantum mechanics. But the cosmological constant Einstein discovered, he tried to hide it, he tried to balance it out, and in the end, he couldn't repress it, this idea that space-time is expanding. In the previous video, I talked about the Jesuit priest George Lemaitre in 1927 pointed out this expanding space-time implication of general relativity. It's called the cosmological constant. It also implies the Big Bang. If space is expanding, in the past it must have been smaller. Go back far enough in the past, it must have been condensed in a single point. That's the Big Bang theory. But what the fine-tuning argument says is if the expansion rate of space-time weren't exactly what it is, then life would not have been able to emerge, so that it requires an explanation. Why should this constant of nature, this parameter of the cosmos, be so perfectly fine-tuned the way it is? It doesn't seem like it would be possible for it to be a random chance. And he mentioned it. It's a trillion, 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 trillion times unlikely to have happened randomly. So he says, indeed, it has been suggested that the chances of lambda having this value are 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. This is going to lead to the multiverse theory. At this point, I want to just bring up this book by Leonard Susskind, The Cosmic Landscape, String Theory, and the Illusion of Intelligent Design. So it is a very serious problem for cosmologists to deal with. How do you explain this extremely apparently fine-tuned cosmological constant? I'll read here from Leonard Susskind's book. This is page 167. He says, "Let me finish this chapter by summarizing the two most important things we have learned from cosmological observations during the last decade." So this book came out, I believe, in 2003. So from 1993, 2006. So from 1996 to 2006, this is the two most important things he thinks physicists have discovered. First, we have found a real shocker. There really is a cosmological constant. The first 119 decimal place is canceled, but astonishingly, in the 120th, the result is not 0. The second point of enormous interest is that the theory of inflation has strong support from the study of cosmic background radiation. So I'm going to skip that part. The next paragraph says, These are both great discoveries, but they are also disturbing. If we reached into a bag of random numbers and pulled out generic values for the constants of nature, neither a small cosmological constant nor a suitable period of inflation would be likely outcomes. Both require an enormous degree of fine-tuning. As we've seen before, the universe appears to have been specially designed. So he'll go on to say, yes, that's the illusion of intelligent design. It's the subtitle of his book. It does appear that the universe has been intelligently designed. He admits that. But then he says, but it's not reasonable to assume that the universe was intelligently designed when you take into account the multiverse theory, which he likes to call the megaverse theory, that there are an infinite number of parallel universes, or if it's not infinite, it's almost infinite. I know that's a paradoxical thing to say, but 1 to the power of 500 to the power of 5, unimaginably enormous, and let's just say, for the sake of argument, an infinite number of parallel universes. Then the fact that this universe has all of the constants of nature so perfectly fine-tuned becomes less mysterious, because while it is remarkably unlikely that we live in one of these perfectly fine-tuned ones, it becomes inevitable that some life forms will exist on some of these universes. And if for those beings, it was inevitable that they were there, and when you see all of the infinite number of chances, this incredibly unlikely scenario will inevitably arise. So that's the counter argument that Leonard Susskind champions, and that's what we'll also be discussing in Tim Bayne's book. So, well, let me now go on to that. So page 37, actually page 36, before we get into that. Before he gets into the multiverse theory. So let's just not assume that there's a multiverse. There's just this one universe. Now, all of a sudden, it does seem like there's an intelligent designer. And as an analogy, he says on page 36, consider the tale of the expert marksman. Suppose that the commander of the prison camp in which you are interned has ordered that you be executed by firing squad. You are marched into the middle of the camp, and although 12 expert marksmen each fire 1,000 bullets at you, you survive unscathed. Okay, what are the odds of that? That's 12,000 bullets shot at you at point blank range by 12 expert marksmen, and you don't die. So you have one of two choices, he says here. There's probably more than that, but either you're incredibly lucky or the event was staged and the commander told the soldiers, don't shoot the guy. Make it appear like he's going to get shot, but don't kill him. In other words, it was an intentional, purposeful decision that you not be shot. Similarly, what are the odds that all the constants of nature are so perfectly fine-tuned to allow for intelligent life to emerge? It seems to be more reasonable to assume that some divine architect arranged it all, rather than it just happened randomly. It would be equally likely for it to happen randomly as for the person who didn't get shot by the 12 expert marksmen to say, I just got lucky. All those bullets just whizzed just past me, all 12,000 bullets. That's unreasonable. It's more reasonable to assume the commander of the camp ordered the soldiers not to shoot you. Similarly, it's more reasonable to assume some intelligent designer orchestrated these constants of nature to be ever so finely precise than to assume that they could have emerged randomly. And Tim Bayne agrees, and so does Leonard Susskind, the Stanford physicist who helped co-discover string theory. But they point out, however, if you have a multiverse of parallel universes, then it seems much less necessary to appeal to an intelligent designer. So, all right, so actually that is one of the questions, the tale of the expert marksman. So let me go back to that. Question B, number 10, for part B, number 10 of exam 1. What is the tale of the expert marksman intended to demonstrate about the fine-tuning version of the cosmological argument? So we went over that. So now question number 4 for part A. Number 4, is the multiverse theory a good objection to the fine-tuning argument for the cosmological constant and other physical constants of the cosmos? Why or why not? Okay, and question 3 was, if the fine-tuning argument connected to the extremely precise value of the cosmological constant required for biological life to exist is correct, what would that imply about Bayne's claim that Darwinism dealt a fatal blow to intelligent design theories about biology? Okay, so question 3 was, if the fine-tuning arguments are correct, then earlier we saw Tim Bayne say Darwinism dealt a fatal blow to intelligent design theories applied to biology in 1859. I said, then general relativity dealt a fatal blow to, or special theory of relativity and general relativity, both say the past, present, and future coexist. So that undermines the standard version of Darwinism, that things can randomly evolve towards some unknown, undetermined future. And then you have the cosmological constant problem, which Leonard Susskind calls the mother of all physics problems. How do you account for this extremely fine-tuned expansion rate of space-time? If there's only one universe, it would seem you have to assume the existence of some kind of a divine architect. And if that is the case, well, what does that say about Darwinism dealing a fatal blow to intelligent design theories applied to biology? I would say, well, if the parameters for Darwinism to emerge were designed by an intelligent designer, by a purposeful agent, then the evolution of species is no longer random. It was preordained by some intelligent being who set up the parameters for its possibility. So it would seem to deal another fatal blow to the standard version of Darwinism, which is based on Newtonian physics, the idea of little insentient bits of unthinking matter extended in 3 dimensions of space and enduring through linear time that travels forward at a constant rate, regardless of your relative position or movement through space. All of that was undermined by the 3 advances in 20th century physics. So that is not addressed. Tim Bayne has not addressed the challenges to Darwinism raised by 20th century physics, although Einstein himself certainly did address that problem. So that was question 3. Number 4, part A, is the multiverse theory a good objection to the fine-tuning argument for the cosmological constant? So the fine-tuning argument on page 37, the multiverse theory, does that obviate the need to appeal to an intelligent designer? Leonard Susskind certainly thinks so. And here's what Tim Bayne says. Let us grant then that the fine-tuning facts require explanation. Can science provide the necessary explanation? Many physicists and philosophers argue that it can. The most influential response here appeals to the many worlds or multiverse hypothesis. Our world happens to be just such a world where everything perfectly coincided, that the physical constants of nature were just the way they are. It makes the fine-tuning argument for the cosmological constant not necessary. You didn't need a fine-tuner. You just needed an enormous amount of chances for this randomly to occur. It's applying Darwinism to cosmology, and there's not a survival of the fittest, but the idea is that given an infinite number of chances, then this extremely unlikely scenario nevertheless becomes, if not inevitable, at least a lot less unlikely to occur randomly. That is how the multiverse theory addresses the fine-tuning argument for the existence of God. So, on page 38, Tim Bayne says, the question, of course, is whether the multiverse hypothesis is true. Are people just making it up so that they don't have to deal with the cosmological constant and the implication of an intelligent designer? No, because it is inherent in what's known as the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which he mentions at the bottom of page 38. So that, which he doesn't mention, was discovered by Hugh Everett III in 1957. In the introductory or the optional YouTube videos, I have one about the double slit experiment, the 2-slit experiment in quantum mechanics. If you shoot electrons or photons or any quantum particles at a wall with 2 slits that are very close to each other, if you shoot them through those 2 slits, you would expect them to line up directly behind them on a detector screen. Whereas if you shot a wave of water at the 2 slits, the wave would hit each slit and then create 2 new waves radiating out, and they would ripple into each other and create an interference pattern where the valley and peak hit each other, they'd cancel out. Where two values hit, they'd amplify. So you'd have a series of light and dark bands. So they wanted to discover, are quantum particles particles or are they waves? Sometimes they behave like a particle, sometimes like a wave. And the weird thing was that after an hour of shooting electrons through these two slits, each electron was always detected as a single particle, but sometimes they would be over to the right, over to the left, up here, down there, and then eventually it reproduced the interference pattern that a wave would have created all at once. The implication is that quantum particles are individual particles when they're being observed or measured, such as by the detector screen. But when they're not being directly observed, they behave like waves. And waves of what? Waves of probability. Waves of probability for where a particle might appear were it to be observed. So Hugh Everett III in 1957 said, well, there's this wave of probability, and when you observe it, it could collapse anywhere, most likely at the peak, but it could be down here, and it could be way out at infinity because the wave stretches out to infinity. So his question was, well, when you observe it, it collapses into a particular point. What happens to all those other potential points that it might have collapsed into? And his theory was that it is just as mathematically accurate to say that each point does manifest in a parallel universe, the only difference between one and the other being the position of that one particle in that one wave of probability. That's the many worlds theory derived from quantum mechanics. And the many worlds theory is also implied in relativity theory and definitely in string theory. So it's not that the physicists created the many worlds theory, the multiverse theory, just to get out of the necessity to explain the fine-tuning of the cosmos, especially the cosmological constant. But nevertheless, it does provide, so says Leonard Susskind, an atheistic explanation with which to dissolve the illusion of intelligent design implied by the fine-tuning argument. So I will now continue to read here Tim Bayne's interpretation of the multiverse theory. He says, we might liken the multiverse scenario to a scenario in which the expert marksmen don't shoot just one prisoner, but fire at a vast, perhaps infinite number of prisoners. In such a scenario, one might expect that although the vast majority of prisoners will die, occasionally someone survives, and of course, it's only the survivors who are in a position to reflect on their luck. Okay, so at the bottom of page 38, he says, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics brings up this idea. So it is a part of physics. It's not just invented to get away from intelligent design theories. And he goes on to say on page 39, the debate regarding the appropriate interpretation of quantum mechanics is ongoing, and it is unclear what the status of the multiverse hypothesis will be when the dust settles. Perhaps all that can be said at the moment is that the prospects for providing a scientific explanation of the fine-tuning facts remains uncertain. Okay, so now he says, let us turn to the third of four claims on which the fine-tuning argument rests. Would an appeal to intelligent design provide a good explanation of the fine-tuning facts? Okay, so let's assume that the universe seems to be fine-tuned. Would an appeal to an intelligent designer be plausible? And he says there are three possible reasons for doubt. The first concerns the obscurity surrounding the notion of divine creation. He said it is far from clear that any kind of being could alter the laws of nature or fix the values of the fundamental physical constants. We saw earlier, he says, how could an immaterial God create a material universe? It's far from clear how that could happen. So it's far from clear from understanding how an immaterial God could fine-tune the constants of nature. How does an immaterial being contact matter? Explain that, and then maybe we can have a conversation, says Tim Bayne, and I point out the Big Bang Theory says that the whole material cosmos came from a singularity, which is not a material thing. It's outside of space because it has zero extension in space, and it's outside of time because it's infinitely dense, which means it has infinite gravity, which is the same as traveling infinitely fast. And if you travel at the speed of light, time stops. So it's outside of space and time. It contains all space and time. If you equate the singularity with God as the omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent entity, then you can have a lot of answers to the questions that Tim Bayne asks. So, secondly, he says, so there's three possible reasons to doubt that an appeal to intelligent design would explain the fine-tuning of the universe. The first one is, how would an intelligent designer go about doing that? Secondly, even if there are agents who are able to alter the fundamental physical constants, we can appeal to their activity to explain the fine-tuning facts only if we are entitled to assume that they would have been motivated to create a finely tuned world. Why would anybody who's intelligent and powerful enough to do so take the time to create a universe with intelligent life in it? So Stephen Jay Gould, he is an evolutionary scientist. He says, if disembodied mind does exist, and I'll be damned if I know any source of scientific evidence for or against such an idea, must it prefer a universe that will generate our Earth's style of life rather than a cosmos filled with diprotons? So, okay, the universe is fine-tuned. It seems it must have been deliberately organized by an intelligent designer. So Stephen Jay Gould, the famous Darwinian scientist, says, why? Let's just, for the sake of argument, assume that there are beings intelligent enough to do it. What would motivate them to create this messy universe? That seems like psychocentric hubris, according to the philosopher J.J.C. Smart. That we just assume people would be interested, infinitely intelligent beings would be interested in creating life forms like us. That it seems kind of hubris. You're taking yourself too seriously. Tim Bayne does not find that. He says, despite the popularity of this objection, I myself am not much impressed by it. He goes on to say, certainly anyone who recoils in horror at the idea that intelligent life might be annihilated by a nuclear holocaust should deny that the fine-tuning argument rests on nothing more than psychocentric hubris. So in other words, intelligent life does seem valuable. So what would be the motivation of an intelligent being to create a universe that creates intelligent life? It's not so implausible. Intelligence, the idea of friendship, love, and creativity, they do seem inherently valuable. It's not just psychocentric hubris. At any rate, that's Tim Bayne's opinion. You might agree with Stephen Jay Gould and say, yeah, it does. We live in a meaningless cosmos of impersonal mechanical forces. The universe doesn't care about us. There's no purpose behind it at all. It's just grinding along inexorably, uncaringly. And humans create these illusions of a caring God to comfort ourselves from the inevitable death of all meaning when our physical bodies rot. So you could just as easily say, that's my opinion, and the intelligent design arguments don't strike me as convincing. At any rate, whatever your answer is, always root it back to the text. So continuing here on page 40, a third reason to doubt whether fine-tuning facts could justify the hypothesis of an intelligent designer is, in my view, much more weighty. Indeed, I regard this objection as one of the most profound in all of the philosophy of religion. When I read that, I said, oh, okay, what's this? The objection has its roots in a question posed by David Hume. Why should we not suppose an animal body to be ordered and organized originally of itself or from unknown causes than in supposing a mind to be ordered in that way? So he explains, we might put Hume's point this way. Think of reality as containing two types of structures, physical structure and mental structure. Design arguments focus on physical structure and invoke the structure of God's mind to explain the structure of the physical world. As such, they treat mental structure as an unexplained explainer. But Hume asks, why should we not treat physical structure as an unexplained explainer? All right, you find a watch on a desert island and you assume, oh, that's been structured symmetrically in a way that you don't normally find in nature. At least nature exhibits symmetry everywhere, but here's this complex machinery. An intelligent designer must have created it. Why? Because it would take some rational being with an understanding of the basics of geometry and physics to create such a complex machine. So Hume is saying, why don't you just assume that complex geometrical organization is inherent in matter? That it doesn't need to be explained any, just like you're saying that the human mind has these understandings of structured thought like geometry. Why is that more fundamental and that is appealed to as the cause of the organized structure of nature. Why does finding order in nature automatically make us appeal to the order of some mind that put that natural order there? Why not just assume matter is unexplainably, inherently ordered? And they'll go on to say, in other words, do we have any reason to think that physical structure requires explanation in a way that mental structure does not? Hume's answer, which seems to me to be exactly right, is that we don't. But if that is right, then no argument which assumes that mental structure is more fundamental than physical structure, as the design argument does, can succeed. So why do we assume that mental structure is more fundamental than physical structure? Well, I'll appeal to Plato's cave allegory and the divided line to explain why it seems reasonable to assume that mental structure is more fundamental than physical structure. So according to Plato, he divided existence into two worlds: the eternal intelligible world of eternal forms or ideas, and the temporary material world of visible forms. The visible forms are always changing from moment to moment. They're never exactly the same, whereas the intelligible but invisible forms are always the same, and they're never unchanging. And so these four levels are: at the bottom level of physical reality is the shadows and two-dimensional reflections of three-dimensional objects. Those three-dimensional objects are the highest level of the visible material world, and they are like shadows of the lowest level of the spiritual world, which are the mathematical forms that describe the physical forms. For example, the Pythagorean theorem, which describes a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So in a right triangle, a 90-degree triangle, both of the hypotenuse squared equals the other two sides, each of them squared and added together. That applies to any 90-degree triangle anywhere in the universe. This is an unchanging mathematical form that describes all of the variety of right-angled triangles that you might find in nature, all of which are imperfect approximations of this perfect idea of triangle. So the three-dimensional physical objects are reflections of these eternal mathematical forms. So the mathematical forms are more fundamental than that of which reflects them. That is what Plato would say, and I would respond the same way to Tim Bayne. He says, Hume's answer, which seems to me to be exactly right, is that we don't. But if that is right, why do we take mental structure as more fundamental than physical structure? He says, but if that is right, then no argument which assumes that mental structure is more fundamental than physical structure can succeed. So mental structure, mathematical physics is mental structure. Why do we assume it's more fundamental than the material phenomena that it describes? Because it's unchanging, whereas the material world that it describes is always changing. So it would seem more fundamental. This eternal, necessary mathematical truth seems more fundamental than the contingent facts that it describes. That's how I would answer. Okay, so now page 41, continuing, he says, let us turn finally to the fourth claim that underpins the fine-tuning argument, and indeed any version of the design argument. Assuming that the advocate of the argument can show that the cosmos was the result of creative intelligence, what reason might she have for identifying that intelligence with the God of theism? Okay, so let's just assume, all right, you're right. The obvious conclusion is that the universe was intelligently designed. The cosmological constant is just too perfectly fine-tuned. However, why do we assume that it's the omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, omnibenevolent God of theism that's responsible? Why not some other intelligent designer? And again, he says, I turn to David Hume for his dialogues concerning natural religion. Here's some other alternatives. Perhaps it's the first rude essay of some infant deity who afterwards abandoned it, ashamed of his lame performance. Perhaps it's some superannuated deity in his dotage, or a dependent inferior deity, or a committee of cosmic architects, or a bug in a supercomputer, says Tim Bayne, or some problem with the cosmic photocopier. So his point is this: even if we accept that the world is the result of intelligent design, the theistic hypothesis is only one of many hypotheses that might be considered. So the question that little excerpt from David Hume addresses is part B, number 11. Do you agree with Hume's argument that even if we assume the universe was created, we have no reason to assume that the omnipotent God of the Bible is the creator? Why or why not? So I think that's a sufficient, we've covered those questions sufficiently. Let me actually just read through them one more time so that you'll be well prepared for the exam. So what we went over in this video for exam 1, part A, question 3. If the fine-tuning argument connected to the extremely precise value of the cosmological constant required for biological life to exist is correct, what would that imply about Bayne's claim that Darwinism dealt a fatal blow to intelligent design theories about biology and explain? So, the fine-tuning argument of the cosmological constant. Darwinism says, well, you can explain the complex structure of living organisms through the process of random mutation and natural selection. You don't require an intelligent designer. However, the cosmological constant of the expansion rate of spacetime itself does require an intelligent designer. If you assume there's not a multiverse, then the implication is yes, there's no other explanation. Somebody fine-tuned everything. If that's the case, what does that imply about Darwinism and how it supposedly killed intelligent design theories in biology? I would say it greatly complicates that claim, because if the whole universe is intelligently designed, then Darwinism doesn't explain away the theory of an intelligent designer. Even if the intelligent designer organized it so that it automatically unfolds according to Darwinian principles, still those Darwinian principles are the source, are rooted in some intelligent designer. So that would greatly complicate Bayne's claim, in my opinion. You might see it another way. If so, explain it, but root your answer in the book. Part A, question 4. Is the multiverse theory a good objection to the fine-tuning argument for the cosmological constant and other physical constants of the cosmos? Why or why not? So one reason you might say it's not a good explanation is that you can't empirically observe universes outside our own. Mathematically, it seems plausible. It's implied naturally in quantum mechanics. It's implied naturally in relativity theory as well, and in string theories. So although it can't be empirically observed, it is mathematically indicated. And if there were an infinite number of universes, that would certainly, in my opinion, provide a plausible explanation for the fine-tuning argument. Although I think it should be pointed out that the monotheistic versions of Hinduism, the Vishnu-worshipping school of Hinduism, does believe in a multiverse. Infinite numbers of bubble universes exhaling from Mahavishnu and then re-inhaling into Vishnu. So there is a monotheistic religion, even though Vishnu has many forms, as one supreme, omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent God. And that most ancient of the monotheistic religions does express a multiverse theory. So while it does provide a plausible explanation for the design fine-tuning arguments, and especially the cosmological constant, it doesn't necessarily preclude theism, as we can see in the oldest form, at least the oldest surviving form of monotheism in Hinduism, which we'll be studying in the next book. But continuing for Tim Bayne's book, question B's, part B for exam 1, question 9, 10, and 11. If the past, present, and future coexist in a four-dimensional space-time, as Einstein's special theory of relativity revealed in 1905, would that have any bearing on Bayne's claim that Darwinism dealt a fatal blow to the biological design argument in 1859? Why or why not? So obviously what I'm trying to do here is point out a flaw in what I perceive to be a flaw in Bayne's reasoning, that Darwinism definitively and forever destroyed the intelligent design theory when it's applied to biology. Because Darwin based his theory on Newton's picture of the universe, which is 3 empty dimensions of space and 1 dimension of linear time, and little ball bearings of insentient matter floating around in that arena. And that cosmology was rendered obsolete in 3 successive stages in the 20th century: special relativity, general relativity in quantum mechanics, and string theory, which is controversial because you can't empirically observe the strings of string theory, which are too small, or the universe is outside our own, which you can't see outside the horizon of our cosmos where space-time is expanding at the speed of light. No light can get in our universe from outside of it because of the faster than light expansion speed of space-time itself, which is determined by the cosmological constant, which we've been discussing. So I say it would have bearing on Bayne's claim about Darwinism destroying biological design arguments. It doesn't mean that relativity theory means that there must necessarily have been an intelligent designer. It just complicates the Darwinian objection to the idea of intelligent design. Number 10, what is the tale of the expert marksman intended to demonstrate about the fine-tuning version of the cosmological argument? The chances of the cosmological constant being precisely the number that it is, a decimal point with 119 zeros and then a 1. If it was anything other than that, life wouldn't have formed. What are the odds that that happened randomly? Well, it would be similar to the odds of some prisoner in a prison camp being ordered to be shot by 12 expert marksmen, each of whom shoots 1,000 bullets. And then after the 12,000 bullets are shot, there he is standing still alive. What's the most reasonable explanation for that? The most reasonable explanation is that the commander of the camp told the firing squad, don't kill the guy. That some intelligent, purposeful agent organized the whole thing. It would be much less reasonable to assume that, oh, I just got lucky. 12 expert marksmen, 12,000 bullets. I just so happened to be on that day where they all missed 1,000 times in a row. That's unlikely. That's what the tale of the expert marksman is intended to demonstrate. The multiverse theory provides an explanation. Okay, now, if there's many universes, then it's more likely that one of them, at least, has all of the parameters for life perfectly fine-tuned the way it is. It's much less mysterious. Number 11, do you agree with Hume's argument that even if we assume the universe was created by an intelligent designer, we have no reason to assume that the omnipotent God of the Bible is the creator? Why or why not? So I think that one you could say, all right, well, if you've granted that the universe is intelligently designed, now what kind of a designer do we have here? I think that is a lot more difficult to explain. And I'll read here to conclude this video. Here's what Tim Bayne says. He says, in my view, a much better response to Hume's objection is to grant that the design argument doesn't take one all the way to the God of theism, and that at best it can establish only that the universe had an architect of some kind or other. I tend to agree with him on that, but that itself is very valuable if you're trying to argue for intelligent design. Okay, you've conceded that the universe must have had an intelligent designer, but now you're saying, but it could have been any number of kinds of intelligent designers. All right, that point is stronger than saying that it didn't have an intelligent designer. That is how I think a theist could respond. But then you could say, well, there is a multiverse. That seems plausible. And if you just assume it emerged without a cause, without a purpose, then now you do have a plausible explanation for the fine-tuning argument. So however you interpret the facts, as long as you know them and relate them to the book, that's how I expect you to develop your answer.